It was Khrushchev, even more than Kennedy, who deserves the lion's share of credit for having avoided war. And for this he was vilified, as Mikhail Gorbachev would be 3 decades later when he democratically presided against his will over the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Chinese charged Khrushchev with cowardice for caving in. Russian hardliners said he had shit his pants. Much of the Pentagon, however, believing that its willingness to go to war had forced the Soviets to back down, determined that superior force would also work elsewhere, especially in Vietnam, where it was necessary once more to make a stand against communism. The Soviets drew the opposite lesson, determined never again to be so humiliated and forced to capitulate from weakness. They began a massive buildup of nuclear weapons to achieve parity with the United States. Weakened by the crisis, Khrushchev would be forced out of power the following year. But first he wrote Kennedy a long letter.
Evil had brought some good. People have felt more tangibly the breathing of the burning flames of thermonuclear war.
In light of this, he made a series of bold proposals for eliminating
everything in our relations capable of generating a new crisis.
He suggested a non-aggression treaty between NATO and the Warsaw Pact nations. Why not, he said, disband all military blocs, cease testing all nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, in outer space, underwater, and also underground. He proposed solutions to conflicts over Germany and China.
Mean and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. It is sad to realize the extent of the gulf between us. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal.
In September of that year, the Senate passed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty by a vote of 80 to 19. Presidential speechwriter Ted Sorensen believed that no other accomplishment in the White House ever gave Kennedy greater satisfaction.
For this treaty is for all of us. It is particularly for our children and our grandchildren, and they have no lobby here in Washington. According to the ancient Chinese proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles must begin with a single step. My fellow Americans, let us take that first step.
For those of us who lived through the 1960s, the Cuban Missile Crisis, coming on the heels of the war scare over Berlin, was a terrifying event. It was one of many nightmares. Call it punches to the stomach of a new generation of American people who had never seen history unfold so quickly, so dramatically, and in such a violent fashion. It would soon be followed by the invasion of Vietnam, a bloodbath, a nightmare of America's own making that would eat Vietnamese and Americans alive for almost a decade. Before we knew it, the United States had replaced Germany with Russia, with Soviet Union as our main enemy. I grew up under that shadow, and for many years I thought communism was the enemy. And I went to Vietnam and Central America, I saw the battles. It dominated the life in America. I don't know about Britain, but it dominated our life. The budgets were enormous, the military expenditures, the sense of commitment to fight communism. And often what we were fighting was not communism, but we were fighting land reform, peasants' independence in Vietnam, the desire for change, for an education, for health, for welfare, the things that poor people don't have. The United States found itself on the side of the oppressor.
Mercury Z10 in partnership with Sky Atlantic HD.
Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate.
East Germans escaped by the tens of thousands until the communists threw up their wall of hate. The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro.
This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression.
I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men. I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. A nation that continues year after year spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. This need to maintain social stability for our investments accounts for the counter-revolutionary action of American forces in Guatemala. It tells why American helicopters are being used against guerrillas in Cambodia, why American napalm and Green Beret forces have already been active against rebels in Peru. They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted.
That posed the greatest resistance to U.S. goals. Aside from Japan, which was becoming a prosperous client state, Red China exploded its first atomic bomb in October of '64, catching Washington totally off guard. In Indonesia, sitting astride Southeast Asia's principal sea lanes, where more than 3 million members made its Communist Party the third largest in the world, behind the Soviets and Chinese, Sukarno, having survived repeated U.S. attempts to remove him, further irritated the U.S. by declaring he would test an atomic bomb. But he was denied help from China. And when he recognized North Vietnam and then expropriated U.S. rubber plantations and threatened to nationalize American oil companies, Lyndon Johnson struck hard. Almost half the officer corps had received some U.S. training, and in October '65, with CIA support, General Suharto led the army in crushing Sukarno's supporters. In the election of 1964, Johnson crushed Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, who threatened to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
It was billed as a landslide for peace. But following the election, Johnson began a steady process of escalation, sharply expanding the free fire zones in which anything that moved was considered a legitimate target. The U.S. arsenal of accepted weapons grew to include napalm, cluster bombs, and white phosphorus, which burned from the skin straight through to the bone, causing horrific deaths.
You smell that? Napalm, son! Nothing else in the world smells like that! I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
Johnson's lies about his plans snowballed, and by July of '65, he'd sent in 75,000 combat troops to Vietnam. More than half a million by the end of '67. The monthly draft reached 35,000 men as the U.S. set out to find Vietnam's breaking point. Yet, when his Joint Chiefs of Staff at a meeting asked for more firepower or an all-out war. A witness recalled Johnson started screaming obscenities.
Imagine that you're me, that you're the President of the United States. Five incompetents come into your office, try and talk you into starting World War III. Risk is just too high. How can you fucking assholes ignore what China might do? You have just contaminated my office, you filthy shitheads. Get the hell out of here right now.
The generals got out, and after a pause, Johnson steadily increased the bombing of North Vietnam. In his inimitable way, he explained his strategy.
I'm going up her leg an inch at a time. I'll get to the snatch before they know what's happening.
The U.S. dropped 3 times as many bombs on tiny Vietnam as it did in all of World War II. On the ground, in a policy sanctioned by Kennedy, millions of peasants, some say 5, some 7, were forced out of villages and resettled in barbed wire camps. Tens of thousands of supposed communists were assassinated as part of a Phoenix program, but it did little to slow the resistance movement. The murder Nixon's secret plan to end the war turned out to be withdrawing U.S. forces starting in April of '69 and replacing them with U.S. trained and equipped Vietnamese, while systematically and ruthlessly bombing North and South Vietnam into submission. Drawing parallels with Eisenhower's nuclear threats in Korea, which he said ended that war, Nixon both, and he and Nixon set out to find him. Nixon's secret plan to end the war turned out to be withdrawing U.S. forces starting in April of '69 and replacing them with U.S. trained and equipped Vietnamese, while systematically and ruthlessly bombing North and South Vietnam into submission. Drawing parallels with Eisenhower's nuclear threats in Korea, which he said ended that war, Nixon boasted to an aide,
I call it the madman theory. We'll slip the word to them that Nixon is obsessed about the communists, that we can't restrain him when he's angry, and he has his hand on the nuclear button. Ho Chi Minh himself will be in Paris in 2 days, begging for peace.
2 months into office, Nixon began a secret bombing campaign inside neighboring Cambodia to destroy North Vietnamese military sanctuaries. He took extraordinary measures to hide it from Congress. Even the crew members involved believed they were hitting targets in South Vietnam. Though most Americans remained in the dark about the country they were invading, the truth occasionally seeped out, as when freelance journalist Cy Hirsch in November 1969 broke the news that a year and a half earlier, U.S. forces had massacred up to 500 civilians in the village of My Lai, nicknamed Pinkville for its strong enemy sympathies. There were few limits to Nixon's thinking. He and Kissinger planned for a savage attack, possibly using nuclear weapons in the fall of 1969, but were thwarted when millions participated nationwide in an October moratorium and 750,000 protesters flocked to Washington in November. Still, Nixon recklessly put the military on secret alert, flying 18 nuclear-armed B-52s over the polar ice cap towards the Soviet Union, trying to force them, once again unsuccessfully, to pressure the North Vietnamese to peace terms. Les Duan took over the leadership when Ho Chi Minh died in 1969, later told a visiting journalist that the U.S. had threatened to use nuclear weapons on 13 different occasions. But that had not changed their policies. Although they would pay a terrible price for their independence, the Vietnamese understood a basic truth that America's leaders never grasped. The Vietnamese foreign minister later said, "We knew that they could not stay in Vietnam forever, but Vietnam must stay in Vietnam."